Chapter 24. Market day in Mount Shannon was well underway. There had been a few showers of rain just after dawn, when most of the stallholders had arrived to set up their shelters and lay out their goods for display. But as the morning wore on, the sun came out and set the dampened ground steaming. Horace and Halt had watched preparations from their campsite as they breakfasted. The villagers knew that market day was a case of first in gets the best goods, so they had thronged to the market while the rain was still drifting down. Now the large meadow, formerly deserted but for their two small tents, and the outsider's pavilion, was a thronging mass of stalls, people, performers, animals, carts, and food vendors. Tennyson and his people were taking advantage of the crowd to promote their message. A small group of them, all in the usual white robes, were singing country folk songs with the occasional hymn of praise to Alsace. The singing was good, and they were managing a 3-part harmony, according to Horace. He commented on the fact to Halt. The ranger shrugged. 3 donkeys braying is much the same as 1, he said, save that it's louder. Halt was not a student of music. Horace smiled at him. Nonetheless, they are good. I'd go and listen to them if I were just passing by, he'd admitted. Halt eyed him. You would? Horace nodded emphatically. Definitely. They're good entertainers, Halt. Halt nodded thoughtfully. Insidious might be a better term, he said. But this is the way they work. They worm their way into people's affections. It's all very easygoing and non-confrontational. Then they spring their trap. Well, they're good trappers, and their bait is very effective, Horace told him. Again, Halt nodded. I know. That's what makes them so dangerous. He stood up, dusting off the seat of his pants. They had spread a canvas square over the wet ground outside their tents, but his backside still felt a little damp. Come on, we'd better look at livestock. Although, thank God, I've seen little in the way of good animals arrive so far. Otherwise, I might have to buy some. We could always eat them, Horace suggested cheerfully. Halt turned a baleful glance on him. It always gets back to eating with you, doesn't it? He asked. I'm a growing boy, Halt, the young warrior said. Halt snorted and led the way towards the market. They strolled among the stalls and the livestock pens. There were plenty of chickens and ducks and geese for sale, and quite a good selection of pigs. There were no cattle, and only a few scrubby, ill-conditioned sheep. Horace commented on the fact. The animals for sale here are the ones that people raise close to the farmhouse, Halt explained. Chickens, ducks, and pigs all stay close by, so the farmer has no call to go out into the fields to tend them. And of course, Horace replied, understanding, people are staying close by their houses these days. Exactly. Halt stopped by a small pen that held 3 sheep. Their wool was coated and matted with mud. He nodded to the owner and stepped into the pen. He caught the nearest, held it between his knees, and pried its jaws apart, peering at its teeth. The sheep struggled in protest at this treatment, and eventually he released it, dusted his hands together, and looked at the owner again, giving a small shake of his head. He stepped out of the pen, and they moved on. So, what's wrong with them? Horace asked after a few moments. Halt turned a curious gaze on him. Wrong with what? Horace jerked his thumb back towards the small sheep pen. The sheep's teeth. What was the problem? Halt made a small mew of understanding, then shrugged. Haven't the faintest idea. What do I know about sheep? But you... I looked at his teeth. That's what people seem to do when they look at animals. They look at their teeth. Then they usually shake their heads and walk off. So that's what I did. He paused, then continued, Did you want me to buy it? Horace raised both hands in a defensive gesture. Not at all. I just wondered. Good. Halt smiled sardonically. For a moment there, I thought you might be feeling peckish. They stopped at a fruit stall and bought several apples. They were good, crisp and juicy, with just a hint of tart flavour hiding behind their sweetness. The two of them crunched away as they inspected a stall full of camping gear and kitchen utensils. Good filleting knife, Holt said. He asked the price of the stall owner, haggled for several minutes, made to walk out in mock disgust, then settled on a price and bought the thin-bladed knife. As they left the tent, he said to Horace, "We should fish for some trout in the streams around here. Make a nice change to the menu." He paused and looked around the nearby stalls. Might as well look for some almonds if we're going to catch trout. Fishing for and catching are two different matters, Horace said, and Holt eyed him sidelong. Are you casting aspersions on my fishing ability? Horace met his gaze. You don't strike me as the fishing type. It's a genteel sort of sport, and I can't picture you sitting sedately with a fishing rod in your hands. Why use a rod when you can use a bow? Holt replied, and Horace frowned at him. You shoot the fish? He said. And when Holt nodded, he went on, That's not very sporting, is it? There was a good deal of hunting and fishing done around Castle Araluen, usually involving the royal family. It was all done according to strict rules and conventions. A gentleman, Horace had been taught, only fished for trout with a rod and with a man-made lure, never live bait. He certainly didn't skewer them on the end of an arrow. At least, he thought ruefully, Holt didn't use live bait. I never said I was sporting, Holt said. I said I catch fish. I doubt they care whether they're killed by a hook or an arrow, and they taste pretty much the same. Horace was about to reply when they heard a cry of alarm. Both of them stopped. Holt's hand went instinctively to the sax knife at his belt. Horace's left hand closed over the top of his scabbard, ready to steady it if he needed to draw his sword quickly. There was a buzz of fear from the people around them. The shout was repeated, and this time they could make out where it came from, the line of trees that marked the eastern side of the market ground. Without needing to confer, they started in that direction. Already a few families were hurrying the opposite way, back to the shelter of the village. Sounds like it started, Holt said, wherever it may be. They threaded their way through the stalls towards the trees. For a moment, Holt considered returning to their camp to fetch his bow. He hadn't brought it, as it didn't quite match the picture of a shepherd looking for new stock in the market. Then he decided against it. He had an instinctive feeling that he wouldn't need the bow. He didn't know why he had that feeling. He just did. They emerged from the cluster of market stalls into clear ground. Over there, said Horace, pointing. An armed man stood a few meters clear of the trees. Behind him, half hidden by the uncertain shadows among the trees, more armed men were visible. Standing between Halt and Horace's position at the edge of the market ground were 3 of the village's watchmen. They too were armed, but their weapons, clubs, a sickle blade mounted on a spear handle, and one slightly rusty sword, seemed inadequate when viewed against the chainmail, swords, shields, and maces wielded by the newcomers. As the 2 Araluans watched, one of the village guards called a challenge to the man standing clear of the trees. That's far enough. You have no business here. Turn around and be on your way. The stranger laughed. It was a harsh sound and totally devoid of any humour. Don't tell me where my business lies, farmer. I'll come and go as I please. My men and I serve Balsenis, the mighty god of destruction and chaos, and he's decided that it's time your village paid him tribute. A buzz of recognition went round the marketplace as he spoke the name Balsenis. They had heard Tennyson warn of this dark and evil spirit, heard him blame the god for the reign of lawlessness and terror that was sweeping Clonmel. Several more of the town watchmen had thrust their way through the crowd. They had obviously armed themselves in haste, and most of them carried makeshift weapons. They formed up in an uneven line behind the first two. There were 10 of them. If their intent was to discourage the stranger with their numbers, they were doomed to failure. He laughed again. "Ha ha! That's what you have to oppose me? 12 of you, armed with sharp sticks and sickles. Get out of my way, farmer. I've got 80 armed fighting men in the trees here. If you choose to resist, we'll kill every man, woman, and child in the village, and then take what we want. Drop your weapons, and we might spare some of you. I'll give you 10 seconds to think it over." Halt leaned closer to Horace and said in a low tone, "If you wanted to frighten people with your overwhelming numbers, would you keep them hidden in the forest?" Horace frowned. He had been thinking much the same thing. "If I had 80 men, I think I'd show them. A show of force like that would be more frightening than simply talking about them." "So, the odds are," Holt said, "that he's bluffing about having 80 men." "Probably. But he's still got the watchmen outnumbered. I can count at least 20 men in the trees. Of course," he added, "the village can probably muster more men given time. Those dozen out there are just the ones on duty at the moment." "Exactly. So why give them time, as he's doing now?" "Time's nearly up, farmer. Make up your mind. Stand aside or die." There was a bustle of movement within the crowd, and Holt looked in the direction it was coming from. He nodded slowly. "Ah, I thought something like this might happen." Horace followed his gaze and saw the burly, white-robed figure of Tennyson pushing through to the front of the crowd. He was followed by half a dozen of his acolytes. Horace recognized them as the group who had been singing earlier in the day, 2 women and 4 men. Strangely, for such a threatening situation, there was no sign of Tennyson's usual giant retainers. The white-robed priest strode purposefully out to stand between the watchman and the bandit chief. He carried his staff, with the usual double-circle emblem of the outsiders at its head. His voice, deep and sonorous, carried clearly to all in the market ground. "Be warned, stranger! This village is under the protection of Alceus, the golden god of friendship." The bandit laughed once more, but this time there was genuine amusement in his voice. "What do we have here? A fat man with another stick? Pardon me while I tremble in fear." As he spoke, some of his men emerged from the trees and moved to form a line behind him. There were perhaps 15 of them in all. They joined in his laughter and called insults and curses at Tennyson. The burly priest stood unflinching, his arms spread out wide. When he spoke again, his voice drowned out the catcalls and insults. "I give you warning! You and your false god cannot stand against the power of Alceus. Leave now or suffer the consequences. If I call on Alceus, you will know pain such as you have never felt." "Well, priest, if I take my sword to your fat hide, you'll know some pain yourself." The bandit drew his sword. His followers did likewise, the rasp of steel sounding across the field. The dozen watchmen, who were slightly behind Tennyson, began to move forward, but the priest signalled for them to stay back. At the same time, the outlaws began to advance towards him. More of them emerged from the trees, swords drawn. Tennyson stood firm. He turned and said a quiet word to his 6 followers. Instantly, they dropped to their knees in a semicircle around him, facing the outlaws, and began to sing. The words of their song were in some foreign tongue. Tennyson raised his long staff and pointed it at the line of advancing bandits. The intruders continued to advance. Then the singers hit a strange and discordant harmony, a strident sound that rang in the air, the overtones setting up a harmonic vibration that seemed to pulse and throb eerily. Tennyson now raised his staff high in the air, and his singers held the note, swelling the volume. The effect was instantaneous. The leading bandit stopped and staggered backwards, as if struck by some invisible force. His men also seemed to lose the use of their limbs, staggering and blundering in wild circles. Some threw up their free hands as if to ward off a physical blow. They cried out in pain and fear. The choir paused for breath, then sang the same chord once more, even louder this time, as Tennyson gestured for them to rise to their feet. With the invisible barrier of the cord preceding them, they began to advance towards the staggering, disorganized bandits. It was too much. The intruders, their spirit broken, turned and fled in terror and confusion, staggering and blundering into one another as they ran back into the trees. As the last of them disappeared into the shadows, Tennyson called a halt, and his choir fell silent. Now the priest turned back to the people of Mount Shannon, who had watched open-mouthed with awe as he drove the intruders off. He smiled at them, holding both his arms wide as if to embrace them. "People of Mount Shannon, give praise to the god Alcaeus, who has saved us this day," he boomed. And the spell was broken as the villagers streamed forward to surround him, calling out his name and the name of his god. He stood among them, smiling and blessing them as they swarmed around him, seeking to kneel before him, to touch him, to shout his name, and to thank him. Halt and Horace stood back and exchanged a glance. Horace scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Funny," he said. "Those bandits were completely disabled. That strange cord hit them like a ton of bricks, didn't it?" "It certainly seemed to," Halt agreed. "Yet, I couldn't help noticing," Horace went on. "They were staggering and suffering and terrified, and completely disoriented by the whole thing. But not one of them dropped his sword."